Hey everybody, welcome to this channel. This is where I discuss things from strength conditioning to sports science to data to everything in between. Now, you might know me recently from a lot of the videos that I've done within our former athlete society, our school community group that I built specifically for supporting those athletes that are leaving collegiate university and entering into the professional world. But otherwise, I've been a strength and conditioning coach for almost 20 years. I work in that sports science space, I work in the collegiate strength conditioning space, and I try to take both methodologies from both and apply it in a very holistic way. Today I want to talk about something that is something that honestly doesn't get enough attention, especially in women's basketball. Now we're talking ACL risk, right? Hamstring strength, and why the posterior chain matters a whole lot more than what a lot of people think. And we're trying to tie that into one of the most valuable tools that we have in our weight room that you might actually have in your own weight room, and that's Vald Performance's NordBord. I'm a gigantic fan of utilizing this piece of technology. It has, when I first got my hands on it, maybe 9 years ago, it's really revolutionized, and I don't use that word lightly. I really mean it. Revolutionized the way that I help diagnose, the way that I see athletes, the way I can understand their risk factors, the way I end up assessing them to see if they're at risk for anything from an asymmetry, a hamstring strain, but particularly in-season monitoring of that posterior chain. Because here's the truth. Injury prevention isn't just only about load management or doing the right exercise. It's about understanding how the body actually works under pressure and how to spot red flags before they turn into missed games, or worse, a season-ending injury. That's what matters. That's what's so near and dear to my heart, is really trying to prevent and reduce the likelihood or the probability of athletes occurring some of these devastating season-ending injuries, right? So let's start, I guess, with the big uncomfortable stat, right? And you probably know this, but if you don't, I want to make sure that I share these things. Female athletes, especially at the college level, are anywhere from 4 to 6 times more likely to suffer an ACL tear than their male counterparts, right? In women's basketball specifically, ACL injuries account for about 20 to 25% of all serious injuries. And that number hasn't moved much over the years. If anything, it's probably getting a little bit worse, right? We have all of these technological advances. We have great strength coaches. We have professionals that are pouring their hearts into the prevention of ACLs, and yet those numbers aren't really rapidly improving by any means, right? So now ask yourself, how many of those injuries were actually, here we go, preventable, right? Because that's the thing. It's not always a freak accident. It's often a breakdown somewhere, usually in deceleration or landing mechanics or changes in direction where the hamstrings weren't doing their job. So the posterior chain is super important. And that's why I think we gotta dive in deep into understanding how that posterior chain functions and why it's so important in women's basketball, right? So what does the hamstrings actually do? Well, besides helping you sprint and jump, they serve a really critical and crucial protective role. They help resist what's called a posterior to anterior tibial translation. And that's a fancy way of just saying that they help stop your femur from sliding forward over your tibia when you're decelerating or when you're planting or when you're stopping. And that movement exactly is what stresses the ACL. Now, there's other components as far as rotation, valgus, we could get into all of those things, but that's one big critical piece to what actually puts stress on that ACL. Now, and really, if that system fails, there's the problem, right? That's one of many problems. That posterior chain, your glutes, your hamstrings, even the calves in some region, in some respects, absorb force and controls movement, especially during things like jump landing, hard cuts, sudden stops, right? Deceleration, or any time an athlete has to decelerate from speed. And let's be real, right? In basketball, that's all of those things. We do all of those movements biomechanically all of the time. Now, this is where I like to plug in the use of a NordBord, right? This is where it really becomes a really critical factor in identifying and then maybe making some changes on your back end to your programming. Now, if you've never seen it, NordBord is essentially a hamstring test device, right? And it gives real-time data on eccentric hamstring strength and also left to right asymmetries. You can get some other things as far as torque goes, but for the most part, I'm just going to talk about peak force, average or max force, average force, and our asymmetry factors. Now, what's cool about it is we're not guessing. We're not using our eyeballs. We're not eyeballing reps or hoping that somebody's glutes are maybe firing. We're getting clear, concise, objective numbers, precise measures of how much force each leg is producing while resisting that lengthening or that eccentric phase of that Nordic curl. And eccentric strength, that's the hamstrings doing exactly what they need to in sport. It's slowing down the body. How often do we see that when people cut and change direction, decelerate and go up for a layup, right? That is eccentric deceleration. Now let me paint for you, right, a real quick picture. Say we have a sophomore forward and she's springy, right? We get a lot of these where they're very elastic, very springy, jumps well, moves well in drills. But when we run her through the NordBord, boom, 20% asymmetry. That left hamstring is lagging way behind the right hamstring. Now, that might not show up every day in practice, right? She might look fine, she might run fine, she might cut, move, biomechanically look great. But when she plants hard on that left leg during a closeout or takes contact on a fast break, that's where that weakness shows up. And that's precisely where that injury risk factor can skyrocket. That probability can increase. So we can build a program that targets that asymmetry. We train single leg eccentrics, tempo-based posterior chain work, or lifts or exercises, maybe some isometric holds, smart stuff. And then we retest, right? Any principle of anybody that's a sports scientist or anybody that's in scientific rigor, if you will, test and retest, test and retest, test, intervene, retest. Let's see if it improves. So 6 weeks later, she's balanced, she feels stronger, and the data, the objective, precise data can back it up. Now that's the difference between hoping an athlete is healthy and then actually knowing that an athlete gets healthier, right? And this is a common issue I see in women's basketball. I've worked in this space for 20 years now, right? So let's zoom out. Let's take a moment. Why does this matter so much in women's basketball? Well, beyond just the ACL risk, a lot of female athletes come in with a bunch of different things, right? Number one, they might be quad dominant. They might have weak glutes. They might be undertrained globally, but also their hamstrings and posterior chain. Poor force absorption patterns, right? When they land or change direction. And that's not a knock. It's a systems-wide issue, right? This is more systemic than just muscular strength imbalances, right? We've spent decades, literally decades, glorifying vertical jump height and linear sprint speed. So maybe as an industry, we haven't spent enough time asking, can she land cleanly? Can she stop with control? Is she strong in the places where it matters the most when she's not moving up and down and sideways and lateral and all of that? So this is a much bigger issue than just what's her jump height? Is she strong enough, right? What's wrong with her? It's not that way. It's systemic. And this is why we have to shift the conversation. Being strong isn't just about big lifts or PRs or anything like that. It's about being able to decelerate under control, to resist motion, not just create it, right? We know athletes can create, they're springy, they're twitchy, they can create motion, but can they actually safely absorb and land and control that eccentric force? And that's what the NordBord helps us measure. It helps us build programming that's individualized, specific, right? And data backed. It's not just a cookie cutter program that you can get off of online or Reddit or anywhere else, right? It tells us who needs more posterior chain work, who's progressing, who needs to deload. And ultimately, it helps keep our athletes on the floor. And that's where it matters, not in the weight room. It's not about loading up PRs in here. It's about keeping them healthy all season long. That's what matters. That's what I'm so passionate about. So yeah, if you're working with women's basketball players, You need to care about their hamstring strength. You need to care about their posterior chain strength. You need to care about their asymmetries. And you absolutely should be tracking it with more than just vibes and video clips. ACL risk isn't going anywhere on its own, right? So we got to leverage the tools, the technologies, and our coaching experience to help build a smarter approach to the way that we train, the way that we test. And then maybe we can actually combat this epidemic that we've seen with rising ACL rates. We can at least reduce the odds, if nothing else, right? We can keep more of our players healthy. And honestly, for us and for those in the women's basketball game, that should be the baseline. That's not a bonus. That's not a nice to have. That's the way that we should be operating as professionals, bar none. So thanks for sticking with me, right? I appreciate you listening to this diatribe and this monologue that I have. I'm passionate about reducing the likelihood of injuries, right? If you found this helpful, maybe give it a share. Give it to somebody that you know that works in women's basketball, right? Somebody that you know that maybe you've coached, maybe you've worked with, maybe they've suffered an ACL. Maybe they're coaching or training on the women's side. And secondly, if you're using the NordBord already or doing hamstring testing in your program in any capacity, listen, this isn't an advertisement for Vald Performance. I don't want to make a state with that, right? If they want to throw money, that's cool, right? I'm just saying I want to leverage the best tools to have really great solutions for problems that we encounter as strength conditioning and sports scientists, right, as professionals. If you're using testing, if you're using the device, if you're using anything else, like a Kinga Tech or something like that, I don't care, right? I'd love to hear how you're building it into your process. So as always, as a coach, to another coach, to a fan, to a whomever, whatever you are, I'll see you in the next one. I appreciate you, and take care, stay strong, stay healthy, and let's keep pushing this coaching industry further, because the athletes that we work with, they deserve it.